Thank you. Uh, Most people have two questions when they first hear about this book. They ask me two questions. One is, were you born in 1959? Is that why it's the year everything changed? And I say, no, I was born in 1954, but thank you for the compliment. It's true, I don't look as old as I am. And second, they ask, well, now what's your next book? Is it going to be about 1964? Which leads me to think that maybe they don't quite take what I'm doing seriously, or think that I don't take what I'm doing seriously. No, the genesis of this book, a lot of people say in their acknowledgments, they recite a story about how they came to write a book, and it's usually, quite frankly, invented. But this is actually the real story that many years ago, it suddenly occurred to me that a lot of my favorite groundbreaking books, movies, record albums, all came out in 1959. Things like Miles Davis' Kind of Blue, Ornette Coleman's The Shape of Jazz to Come, uh, Norman Mailer's Advertisements for Myself, the first French New Wave films, first Lenny Bruce sick comedy record. And I began to wonder, well, is this just a coincidence, or was there something about that year that made all these things coalesce? Was something broader going on? So I casually began looking into that question and came to the conclusion that yes, there are actually not just a lot of very cool things going on, but that they all converged to form a pivotal year. I mean that quite literally, that the country was going in one direction, and then at that point it shifted and started going in another direction. Not all the changes were apparent immediately. There's the Woody Allen joke about how, the guy who says, I have to get back in Italy because the Renaissance is beginning. It's nothing like that, but there is a pivot, and you can see in retrospect that things do change. So I worked very hard on making the first chapter a true summary of what the book is about. So I'm just going to read from it, although I'm going to leave out, if you're reading along, I'm just going to leave out little bits of it that, slow things down a little bit in the oral reading. So, on January 2nd, 1959, a Soviet rocket carrying the Lunik 1 space capsule, also known as Mishta, the Dream, blasted off from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kuratum, Kazakhstan, accelerated to 25,000 miles per hour, the magical speed known as escape velocity, sailed past the moon and pushed free of Earth's orbit, becoming the first man-made object to revolve around the sun among the celestial bodies. The next issue of Time magazine hailed the feat as a turning point in the multi-billion-year history of the solar system, for one of the sun's planets had at last evolved a living creature that could break the chains of its gravitational field. The flight of the Lunik set off a year when chains of all sorts were broken with verve and apprehension, not just in the cosmos, but in politics, society, culture, science, and sex. A feeling took hold that the breakdown of barriers in space, speed, and time made other barriers ripe for transgressing. 1959 was the year when the shockwaves of the new ripped the seams of daily life, when humanity stepped into the cosmos and also commandeered the conception of human life. When the world shrank, but the knowledge needed to thrive in it expanded exponentially. When outsiders became insiders, when categories were crossed and taboos were trampled, when everything was changing and everyone knew it, when the world as we now know it began to take form. Just 2 months before Lunik, the jet age roared into being when a brand new Boeing 707 took off with great fanfare on the first nonstop jet flight across the Atlantic to Paris. On the runway, First Lady Mamie Eisenhower declared, I christen thee Jet Clipper America, before smashing a bottle of ocean water across the plane's nose and cheering with a crowd of thousands as the plane rolled down the runway while the Air Force band played the Star-Spangled Banner. The New York Times enthused over, quote, the possibility of hurdling an ocean from one continent to another, from one world to another in half a dozen hours. Age-old longings that were no longer daydreams because the jets are here. Now, with the new year barely underway, the world was thrust into the space age. The Russians and the Americans would go at it in a space race all year long, back and forth, each side trumpeting some new triumph with startling alacrity. Outer space and lightning speed animated the popular consciousness. Mass circulation magazines and newspapers ran lengthy articles explaining the new geography of solar orbits and galaxies. NASA lingo, blastoff, countdown, AOK, swooshed into the everyday lexicon. Madison Avenue picked up on the coinage with advertisements touting new products from cars to telephones to floor waxes as jet age, space age, the world of the future, the countdown to tomorrow. And tomorrow promised to be not just another day, but a new dawn. The era's rising young political star, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, would run for president on a slogan of leadership for the 60s, the first time that the future was defined in terms of a decade, which held out both menace and hope, but in either case, great change. Kennedy presented his youth as a virtue, another reversal of the norm, describing himself as a man born in this century, keen to explore the new frontier. The phrase was a reference to Frederick Jackson Turner's classic essay of 1893, The Frontier in American History, which argued that the American character, its restless, nervous energy and dominant individualism, was a product of the frontier's vast emptiness, with its prospect of a continuous expansion westward, each step siring new opportunities for conquest, settlement, and perennial rebirth. By the 50s, this frontier had long been filled and settled. The new frontier now lay in outer space, and its prospect of seemingly infinite expansion set off a new way of seeing and experiencing on Earth. The space program itself and the markets that it seemed certain to generate spurred scientists to develop new technologies, most notably the microchip and faster, smaller computers, which would transform the fantasies of science fiction into the routine of daily life. This enchantment with the new also galvanized a generation of artists to crash through their own sets of barriers and attracted a vast audience that was suddenly, even giddily, receptive to their iconoclasm. New comedians, sick comics, some called them, satirized the once forbidden topics of race, religion, and politics. Brazen novelists loosened the language and blurred the boundaries between author and subject, reportage and literature. Rebellious filmmakers shot improvised movies outside the confines of Hollywood studios. Painters created a new kind of art that streaked outside the canvas. Jazz musicians improvised a new kind of music that broke through the structures of chords and preset rhythms. A new record label, Motown, laid down a jazz-inflected rhythm and blues that insinuated black culture into the mainstream, inspired baby boomer rock and roll, and supplied the soundtrack for the racial revolts and interminglings that lay ahead. These currents were quickened by a series of expansive government edicts. The new United States Civil Rights Commission ordered a series of investigations on racial discrimination in voting, housing, and schools. The Supreme Court issued rulings that lifted restrictions on free speech and literature. Toward the end of the year, the Food and Drug Administration held hearings that resulted in the approval of a birth control pill, which unleashed a revolution in women's lives and in sexual activity, unbridled and spontaneous. Yet the thrill of the new was at once intensified and tempered by an undercurrent of dread. Outer space loomed as a frontier not only for satellites and rockets, but also for missiles and H-bombs. And so the year also saw panic over fallout shelters, fears of a missile gap, and an escalation of the Cold War. Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, boasted that his defense factories were churning out nuclear-tipped missiles like sausages. In the U.S. Congress, the Joint Atomic Energy Committee held 5 days of public hearings on the effects of a limited nuclear attack. Scientists were detecting hazardous levels of radiation in milk as a result of H-bomb tests in the atmosphere. A mordant physicist named Herman Kahn toured the country and tantalized large crowds with marathon lectures on how to fight, survive, and win a nuclear war. It was this twin precipice, the prospect of infinite possibilities and instant annihilation, both teetering on the edge of a new decade, that gave 1959 its distinctive swoon and ignited its creative energy. The latter half of the preceding decade, especially from 1945 to 47, when America created the bomb, won World War II, and emerged as a sprawling global power, also marked a vivid turning point, but it would take another dozen years before the nation set out or stumbled forth in a clear new direction, before it responded to the shifting contours and redefined itself in their light and shadows. The new path was carved by the younger generation, those who grew up through depression and war and who felt dissatisfied with the false peace that followed, bent out of shape or spurred to revolt by the dissonance between the new era's promised hopes and palpable fears. It was in the late 1950s that the war years adolescents and young soldiers came into their own, approaching the ages of 30 or 40, too young to shove their elders out of power, but old enough, and self-consciously so, to claim a stake in the future and to make themselves heard. The raucousness reached a crescendo in the next decade, the 60s, with the sexual revolution, free speech, rock and roll, campus uprisings, and racial riots, all erupting against the escalation of a savage war in Southeast Asia and the wondrous spectacle of landing a man on the moon. Yet all of these cataclysms sprang not from the impulses or ideals of the baby boom generation, but rather from the revolts and revelations of 1959, and many of the new instigators were well aware of their roots and took inspiration from their predecessors.